Whoa.
Hi, Matthew. Thanks for coming on. For those of you that don't know Matthew, he's been sort of part of the QTube family since almost day one. I mean, you were with us on our very first round table, weren't you, back in 2020? Do you remember that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, back in the was that during COVID times or it must
Yeah,
have been?
yeah.
Yeah.
So it would have been roughly, I think, October 2020. So yeah, we were
Yeah.
we were still in the throes of COVID, and we had Naveed from Trinidad and Anthony from Scotland, and we had Roger, of course, from Canada. So
Mm.
yeah, it was good actually. We should recreate that, I think.
We should, yeah. And I think I'm pretty sure that I'm still in contact with all of those as well.
Me
Definitely
too.
Anthony, we speak quite regularly. So
Me too.
yeah.
Yeah, they're all doing reasonably well, and I might go and see Anthony soon, actually, up in Edinburgh. So
Mm.
yeah, join us.
Yeah.
It's not far from Cornwall, you know.
No, it's not that far.
All right, so Matthew, before we get into the specific, really the reason we're here is to talk about this brilliant project that you've been working on, which is a brand new game, and you've been doing the music for that. But before we go into the meat and potatoes of that, do you want to just give a very quick sort of bio, just a background about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So I started out in bands, writing music in bands as a guitarist or a piano player, and then never quite settled on a genre. And I think I soon realized that it's because I actually just wanted to be a composer of music rather than trying to pigeonhole it into a specific.
Rather than being a rock star kind of thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, it sounds like too much hard work, really. So then I was lucky enough to kind of do a couple of short films, in the early days, and that was, this was not transactional. There was no money involved. Like I was lucky enough to be asked to do them, and it was a great way of me getting my sort of cutting my teeth in composition. And then I actually took quite a long break from doing it because I was traveling a lot and took a break from music full stop, and then kind of came back into it about 5 years later. And since then I've been working on a lot like feature films, short films. I do a lot of work with theatre and dance companies. I love working with choreographers. And most recently started working in game, which was something that I never really pointed myself towards particularly. It just sort of happened, and this particular project was a really good fit for my style of writing. So
that's great. That's a nice lead into talking about the project. So, like, when did you first get involved with games in general? What was your first move towards the game industry?
Well, I mean, I don't know whether I ever did move, to be honest. I'm not really a gamer. It's just something, that I did when I was younger. And a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, works was one of the directors of Future Friends games, and we've often talked about work. We've never talked about our works crossing over. And they develop and they're like an agent for indie games, but very specifically high quality indie games. But they also co-publish games as well. And anyway, so my friend heard my soundtrack for a film I did called Long Way Back, and he got in touch and said, I think this would be such a good fit for Europa. And that was my first introduction into games. And I'll be honest, I absolutely loved it. It's such a good medium to work in. And it's been an amazing experience.
Fantastic. Well, there's a lot to talk about with the game. I mean, it sounds like it's a superb project, and it's good timing, really, isn't it, in terms of the life cycle, the life cycle of the project as well. So we'll talk about that. So, do you want to give us a little bit of background then about the game
Sure. Yeah, sure. So, the game, the creative director is a chap called Helder Pinto, and Helder is based in California. He's worked on multiple AAA games, so he used to work for Blizzard. So we worked on games like Overwatch and Diablo and these huge games. As an art director and an environment builder. So kind of creating these landscapes. And so Europa was his kind of passion project that he started on the side maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And it sort of grew, and then the publishers got on board, and then a small team was built around the project in Helder, and I'm one of those people. We're basically across 2 time zones, so some of us are in Europe, some of us are in America,
Right.
and yeah, I think every person working on the project has been working on it outside of their normal work hours. It's the long game, this kind of thing. You know, these people are putting the hours in now for the rewards that will come,
Yeah.
you know, in terms of rev share and things like that later down the line.
Yeah.
But it's been amazing, and very fortunately that the whole team, and Helder in particular, is a really sort of easy collaborator. Like, he knows exactly what he wants, but he's very trusting. So he sort of says, well, I've got this team around me I know I can trust. Go and do what you do. And yeah, he gives me a lot of freedom, or gave me a lot of freedom to write. So
that's great. So, like, how was the connection made? Was it through this kind of mutual acquaintance then?
Yeah, so it was Alex at Future Friends Games who put me in touch with Helder. I had some initial meetings with Helder, and he sort of in the meeting walked, like, actually we shared a screen. He was walking me through some of the zones. He was telling me what his vision was. The big thing with Europa is this sort of hero's journey, and that was the overarching thing. So and then we had these chats, and then we decided to kind of pull the trigger and say, yeah, let's do it, and I'm on board. And that was in summer of 2023. So it's been a long project, and I think I've worked on, I think, over 130 minutes of music, which is an enormous amount of music, given that most of the pieces are maybe 2 to 3 minutes long. Like, it's a lot of work.
Do you think it's comparable in scope to working on a feature, or do you think it's actually more, or how would you compare it?
I think this is more. I think more. I mean, the one thing I would say is that working in film is it can be quite a different process, because you can often be tied to a locked picture. So, you know, you might have a conversation with the director, or get a spotting sheet where they'll say, you've got 33 seconds to take the audience on this little journey and resolve it musically. So it has to make sense musically, and it has to fit this sort of emotive feeling. Whereas in game, or particularly in this game, because you're sort of roaming a lot, there's sort of trigger points in each level where a song will start. So I could actually make the pieces really as long or as short as I wanted. So it was much more kind of musical, if that makes sense. You could genuinely say, right, I'm just going to compose a piece of music, rather than I'm going to compose a piece of music that fits in this very small parameter. So it was really liberating, actually.
A bit different from a cue, more like little suites of music almost.
Exactly. And I wrote most of it as much as possible away from a screen, because I thought, if I sit at the screen and I've got the game in front of me, I don't know. Yeah, I'll feel constrained. I'll get sucked into it too much. And what I actually did was I played the game a lot. So I played the game, I'd go away and sit on my piano, and then I'd just start composing, as if I was composing a suite of music to perform, or, you know, not for media of any type.
Right.
And I kind of wanted the soundtrack to be a sort of standalone thing that people would enjoy listening to, as a cohesive piece of work, rather than just, you've got these little cues. Now, there are cues in the game, don't get me wrong, because there's these sort of, and in most games you have these cinematic moments, you know, of where you're not playing, where it's in between levels, and they were very much cues. You know, you've got this many seconds, and there were probably about maybe 30 of those sort of moments,
right?
And I kind of thematically tied all of those into the main music that's in that level. So it was really interesting, and yeah, like I say, I've got swathes of music, which, it's been really fun, but also kind of strange to then finish a project like that when you've been so immersed in that world and that sort of style. So the style we went for was very lyrical. It was very kind of romantic in a way. I mean, there's bits of drama and things as when it's required, but a lot of it is quite minimalist. It's very meditative. I use lots of like major seventh and minor seventh chords. It's got this kind of vibe. I use a lot of the pentatonic scale in this particular soundtrack, actually, because it's sort of the game's heavily influenced by Studio Ghibli, so
Right.
I've kind of
Yeah.
gone for that kind of Asian
Yeah.
feel.
That's definitely the vibe you get from the visuals. I mean, there's a little bit, it's a little visible behind you, and it definitely has that vibe.
Yeah.
Almost like a watercolor vibe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's kind of one thing the game's really been lauded for. And it's been lauded for years, like a number of years since it first got announced. Like, and it's received so much hype because it's this opportunity for people to effectively roam and fly around in a world that looks a lot like a Studio Ghibli film. So it's picked up an enormous amount of organic
traction
because of that reason. And
Right.
and I think before release, I think it had over 260,000 wish lists on Steam just for the PC version alone, which is an enormous amount for an indie game.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, for myself and probably for quite a lot of my audience, if you like, for this interview, you know, there's not that much that I know, certainly about Steam and about the game industry and the way that it works. I know that you mentioned, you know, you've just mentioned some couple of bits about Steam and the kind of pre-ordering process almost. Yeah. How does it work?
Yeah, so again, this is something that I've had to come to sort of like skill up on as well. But yeah, so Steam's the sort of platform that most people purchase their games for PC through. And they take a cut, basically. That's the way it works. It's all digital. I think they maybe take like 30% of takings on games, which is quite a significant chunk.
It is. It's big.
It's a big chunk, but then they also have the, you know, millions and millions and millions of users worldwide, and it can really, you know, without it, it'd be pretty impossible to get your game anywhere. But there's also the great thing about it is that you can do these sort of bolt-ons. So there's options when you purchase the game. You can just purchase the game, or you can purchase the game with the soundtrack, and you can purchase the game with the soundtrack and the making of ebook and things like that. And it's kind of a different experience. So it kind of gives people the options. And one thing that I've found really interesting and amazing actually about the gaming world is how passionate gamers are about music and I think it's probably to do with the fact that they're so immersed in the music for such a long period of time, or maybe repeatedly immersed in the music. You know, if you write music for a film, people will hear it for 30 seconds. The chances are you're not going to hear it again in the rest of the film unless it's, you know, whatever. But in the game, it's there. It's in your head, ticking around constantly.
Yeah.
And I've had an enormous amount of feedback from players all over the world messaging me saying how immersed they've been by the soundtrack, how much they love it, and
amazing.
And yeah, it's been quite phenomenal, the kind of response. It's also the only format that I can think of where you almost get like real-time feedback. So, you know, people don't really film themselves watching a film, but they'll film themselves playing a game, and you can watch them for hours if you want. You know, there's hundreds, thousands of these videos of people playing the game all over the world, and you know, you can just tune into one like on Twitch or something, and you might go, oh, you see it on Twitter, or you go, I'll dip in and see how they're doing, and they're playing the game, and you know, they might be saying, wow, this music's really beautiful. And it's very surreal because you almost feel like you kind of shouldn't be in the room with them, but it's also really nice. Or, you know, people will be like, actually, I don't like this game, and you have to kind of have quite a hard, you know, a hard hat on for that. A hard skin.
No, that is absolutely fascinating. As you say, it's a completely unique experience for you as the creator, as the composer, but also, you know, the experience of the recipient, if you like, if your work is so unique, because they are truly immersing themselves into the world that you're creating in a different way from how they do when they watch a film. And I mean, films are very immersive, of course, but you know, in a game, you're actually interacting, aren't you, with the environment? So, very interesting.
Yeah, and there's an element of, well, there's a big element of freedom. So you have agency over what happens in that world. So you're controlling the actions of that character. You might choose to play the game very, very fast, or you might choose to just wander and listen to the music. And I know that one of the patches that the developers did for the game, which I think is an amazing idea in terms of accessibility for people who maybe have sensory issues, but they've done a Zen mode, so you can play the whole game with no jeopardy. So there's no I mean, there's not a great deal of jeopardy in the game, but there are these sort of gun turrets. You can't die, but they can stun you, but it can get a little bit anxiety inducing sometimes, when you're getting bombed at, but there's an option to take all of that away, so you can literally just fly around, solve puzzles,
wandering around,
wandering. And it's very meditative. It's a really mindful game, and
that's what I need. That's what I need.
Yeah, same. I've really enjoyed playing it, and for someone who doesn't really play games, it's been a kind of a new thing for me.
Fantastic. So, I mean, would you? This is a very free form conversation. There's so much to touch on. From the technical aspects of the music, all the way through to stuff like this and meditation and everything. So, for the composers out there, I think it's, I'd just like to explore a little bit more about Steam, because, you kind of mentioned, but perhaps we could just highlight this a little bit more.
Yeah.
The fact that, it's interesting from the point of view that Steam and the game industry provides a number of different models for revenue for the composer. So obviously you could just do the music for an upfront cost, and the developer or the producer pays you, and then that's it, you walk away. But there are other methods as well,
yeah. So I'd say for anyone who's sort of interested in getting into games and things like this, is kind of important information, because you might not always have people as friendly as I had around me that helped me through that process. But yeah, so in the instance of Europa, so I was given a fee to write the music, which a fee that was kind of mutually agreeable. It wasn't like a really high rate, because I knew that it's an indie development, but there was potential that there was a legacy, we call it a legacy income or a passive income once the game's done, which is not always the case with films. So Steam really enables that, because everyone's agreement will be different with the publisher. My agreement with the publisher was that the sort of soundtrack revenue, the first bunch of it would be mine, and then after it hit a certain threshold, it goes to like 50%. But actually that passive income is really important, and actually is probably going to yield more money than the actual upfront cost. So it's really important to talk about these things when you have a when you start discussions with people, and it also gives you the impetus, and it gives you some impetus to say, well, actually, what can I do to maximize the interest in the soundtrack? Like, how can I make this soundtrack more appealing? And I think sometimes it's really easy, especially when you're working on an enormous amount of music, like a lot, you can just be like, well, that's fine, that'll do, or whatever. And actually what I thought was, no, I need to make this a significant piece of work that people will enjoy, even if they've never played the game. Like, focus on the music, don't worry about the context. Like, make a great piece of music, and people will enjoy it, and they'll want to buy it, and they'll want to listen to it, and therefore, and you'll end up getting more work in the future, hopefully. And I think that's something that I've come across quite a lot, and I've with like in the composing world, that people can get very kind of one-pointed with what they're doing in terms of project by project, and thinking, well, this is the process, this is how you do it, or I'm a games composer, or I'm a film composer, and this is what I do. And I think actually it's sort of, I don't know whether it comes through the formal education of composing, but actually I think sometimes you've just got to think, well, just focus on the craft, just write good music. It doesn't matter what it's for, like, it doesn't matter what the medium is. That should always be the priority, is the music, not how fancy you can make it, not how well orchestrated or the fanciest plugins and things like that. It's actually what are you communicating to the audience? And that's kind of what mindset I've developed over the years, for sure. Fantastic. Sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent then, but it's...
No, it's great. These are all really useful tangents, and if they aren't, I'll rein you in. Do you want to talk a little bit about the actual process, and maybe we're going to show some of the stuff in the door? And anything that you want to share with us, really, about the process and the even aspects of writing for game? Yeah.
Okay. So it's very different. So one thing that we did in this game is we have a Discord server that we all the creative team are on, So you have a music channel, a cinematics channel, a programming channel, yada yada yada,
Right.
all the different channels. So there's this constant line of communication, which is amazing and really important when you're in different time zones. But so the spotting sheet, so the sheet which tells you exactly where we need music, is pretty significant for a game that's hours and hours and hours long. And you have to break it down into chunks. And what I did was I coded everything. Every piece of music had a sequence. It was like Act 1, Zone 2, Part 3. And so none of the pieces had names until maybe a month before release. They were all just these codes.
Right.
And placing them in particular points in the game that you agree with the director, or or they might already know exactly where they want the music, but that's always open to discussion. And then in between those points, there's always an ambient underscore. So you have for each zone or each level, you maybe have 2 or 3 main pieces of music, and then you might have 2 background music pieces, but they all have to be cohesive, so they all tie in.
Right.
So once you've got that sheet, it's then a case of playing the game an awful lot, familiarizing yourself with the environment, and at what point it is this level at in the narrative, the overall narrative. So the music might get darker towards a certain point, and you need to bear that in mind. If you just take it sort of like zone by zone and you say, oh, look at all this pretty Aurora Borealis there, I'm going to write this really lovely music, but then in the grand scheme of the game, there's actually a really dark bit of the game. Then you've got to factor all these things in. So it's one thing chipping away at it slowly, working on basically crossing things off. And then what I'd do, I'd record maybe like a draft version of something, send it to the developers. They can put it in the game real time. So when you develop a game, you can develop it via Steam as well, so that all the people on the team can access the game through Steam, but it's like a private way of getting into the game.
Right.
And then they'll try it in real time and they'll say, we think this is working, great, finish it or develop it. Or you might both play it and go, actually, you know what, I wrote it, but it really doesn't work. Like that's not working at all. So there was lots of music that you have to have a hard skin as well. I mean, everyone knows that in this sort of world, you will get told that's not working at all, don't like it, and you might have just spent a whole day or 2 days working on something, and then you have to really put your ego to the side and say, you know what, it's not my decision here, and then you start again.
Do you think that works in very much the same way as film, or do you think there's a slight difference in the way that kind of feedback from the developer works compared to a director of a film, or do you think it's essentially the same?
I think it's probably essentially the same, but I think every developer and every director is different, or every producer in a film is different. Like, so you'll get some that are very hands-on, and we all know the type that go, oh, I want something that sounds like, Max Richter or whatever, or Einaudi or Hans Zimmer, or like a very specific piece of music. And I always really hate that. Like I find that really difficult because I'm not really interested in recreating someone else's music. But also it's really limiting. But you can normally ease through that a little bit and be creative. Or you get some directors and producers that just say, this is the world, I trust you, you do it. And they'll still have an opinion, but it's very much case by case. But in this instance, we had a really good open dialogue about what was working and what wasn't, and there were multiple people involved in that conversation as well. So there was producers, and people were open, and normally you end up with the best result. Like it might not be that easy to take sometimes when someone tells you they don't like it, but ultimately you get to the right point and you're all happy with it. So it's been interesting. But I mean, in terms of the kind of like nuts and bolts of making the music for this game, so the budget was covering me and my time and for writing, but it wasn't like an enormous budget where I can go, right, I'm going to go and book Air Studios for a week or something. It was, so I had to be really, really creative because I wanted it to sound big and cinematic. So I kind of used a blend of plugins that I know are good quality, but also like we use them in a way that doesn't scream that they're plug-in straight away. And I kind of did that by mixing a sort of sprinkling of organic instruments and players in as well, and actually you can get an amazing result. Like I have a friend of mine, Ben, who plays the violin on the soundtrack, and he's based out in West Penwith in Cornwall, right in the middle of nowhere, lives in this little stone cottage, and he's got his own little studio. And I'd send him,
Make him sound like a hobbit.
well, I mean, he'd probably be the first to say he's a little bit like a hobbit. He's a bit taller, maybe, but incredible composer, but in his own right, by the way. And I would send him I'd MIDI all of the parts. I didn't actually score them. I knew he's capable of just playing them. So I sent him over the MIDI, and I think he recorded maybe for one particular piece, he recorded about 18 different string parts for me, bowed them all differently, changed the mic angles, so that it sounds like a different player.
Yeah.
And then I was able to then mix it all, create a full symphonic sound. And it was like a day's work for, it was a day.
Fantastic.
That he did it in. And I did the same with bits of cello, and I had a flute player. And particularly, so the violin was also really useful, aside from the symphonic stuff, the melodic lines, you can't get better than an organic, you're not going to be able to recreate really a solo violin line that's expressive. I mean, they've got pretty close now, but I think, So the things like the flute melodies and the violin melodies, I wanted to make sure they were real, and it was well worth me investing that small amount of money, in context, to get that sound. When you're paying these people that, this is kind of coming out of my pocket, but actually the end result is so much better in the long term. It's so much better. It's such a good investment.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in that. One of the things that's obviously informed my opinion about this is score relief. To hear the winning piece of music then re-rendered by an actual orchestra, and it's just chalk and cheese, even though it's ostensibly the same music. Of course, it generally needs to be slightly modified for the configuration of the orchestra, but ostensibly the same piece of music. And you put them side by side, and it's fascinating, because they're both great, but what the real musicians bring to the table is really priceless.
Yeah, and they know their instruments, the limitations and how the things that they can do on their own instrument. I mean, there's one piece called Z's theme on the soundtrack, which is just piano and solo violin, and it comes at a really emotive part of the game. And it has this kind of melody that goes, and I just couldn't. I could have played it on MIDI, but what Ben did was he was like, I could have sung it. Yeah, he was like sliding up. He was sort of creating this totally different texture that would have been impossible to recreate.
Yeah,
but it touches your soul straight away because it's really magic.
That is lovely. I mean, even hearing you talk about it is giving me like goosebumps, I can just well imagine. And then I can imagine how you felt when you received it from him. Well,
it's like Christmas morning, It's one of my favorite things to happen is when you get the stems back off someone.
Yeah.
And I might be in the middle of the day with my family, and I'm not meant to be working that day, and they're sat in my inbox. I'm just like, oh, I've got to go to my studio. I can't wait. I need to hear it,
Yeah.
or
God.
wait till everyone's in bed and get straight on my headphones. And you just start putting them in your door, just like laying them all out, and then the first time, it's nothing like it.
Yeah. That is great.
And it's interesting. Like a lot of the feedback from the soundtrack that people have sort of commented anecdotally is, how cinematic and how huge it sounds. And I feel like that's one of the proudest things I've got with the soundtrack, is that I was able to kind of pull that off
Yeah.
with just a handful of people and in a small studio, in Cornwall.
And so let's use the remaining sort of 5 minutes or so to talk
Mhm.
about, where is the game at? What's happened
Mhm.
with the game? Because I think you picked up some accolades and stuff. And
Mhm.
anything else that you want to talk about, like for example, the soundtrack, that people
Yeah,
obtain it, and
sure.
what's happening next with this project and what's happening next with you.
Okay, great. So, I mean, Europa's it's been out for about 2.5 weeks now.
Mhm.
The last time I saw it was in the top 10 of the Switch charts, which is amazing for an indie game. Um,
Well
and
done.
it's picking up a lot of momentum.
Must be nice to see that.
Yeah, it's also really surreal. The whole thing is quite surreal, seeing it's sort of in lots of different spaces and
Mm.
people are talking about it. Um, and yeah, it's been nominated for a couple of awards already, which is brilliant. Um, and yeah, so it's going to be out on the on PS5 and Xbox next year. So they're the next consoles that'll be out on.
Okay.
The soundtrack, I've got two record labels releasing the soundtrack on vinyl and CD. So one in Japan, which is
Mm.
it's called Disc Union, which is a great
Yeah.
label over there. So that'll be like an exclusive Japanese release.
Oh wow.
And then one in Europe and the rest of the world, basically, with a label called Lost in Cult, which specialize in making beautiful, tangible objects to do with games. So
Wow.
they kind of bring digital art, and anyway, so they want to create a legacy of physical
Right.
entity. So they're going to release the vinyl for the soundtrack.
So when would that? I mean, I'd actually be interested. When would that be available?
So that's they're going to be out in early 2025. So normally vinyl releases are kind of a bit after, so they normally wait for people to kind of really fall in love with a piece of work, and then they'll release it on vinyl. Because if you're like me and you like vinyl,
Yeah.
you very much go with the heart, don't you?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so they'll be out in early 2025. I think they're going to start doing pre-orders in January.
I almost want to get the Japanese one,
I know, I do. I'm hoping they're going to send me a few copies.
Yeah, I've got some friends out there. I might try and get a hold of one.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I definitely want to get some as well. But and I mean, at the moment, it's available on YouTube. You can listen to the whole soundtrack. There's actually two soundtracks. There's one main soundtrack, and then I've done an ambient mood soundtrack, which is lots of the ambient work and sort of minimalist piano. So it's quite nice. There's because there's so much music, I could do that. So they're both on my YouTube channel, which is Matthew Thomason Music.
Okay.
If you just search Europa soundtrack, Matthew Thomason.
We'll share it.
Oh yeah, great. You can share it in the link so that you can listen to it now. And it's also going to be on all the streaming sites, from November the 1st. So I'd really appreciate if people give it a listen. And if you want to connect with me on Instagram, that's where I do most of my
Brilliant.
sharing my work on there.
Yeah, no, Matthew's got a great Instagram. You've been doing some touring, haven't you? You've been doing some performance.
Yeah, so I do quite a lot. I compose kind of classical piano music for performance as well. So I've been touring that around Europe a bit, and I'm just developing a new romantic era song cycle, which is quite niche, based on Tennyson's Lady of Shalott poem, which is like a 12-song cycle, classical piano with a soprano vocalist. And it's all been translated into the Cornish language, so it's quite unique. So that's all happening at the moment.
You're quite involved with some sort of like Cornish language projects, aren't you? Different ones.
Yeah, so I'm learning to speak Cornish, and there's a real in Cornwall. I'd be kidding if I said it was happening anywhere else, but there's a real buzz about the Cornish language at the moment, and sort of maintaining that cultural heritage. And it's something that really interests me. If people aren't familiar with it, Cornwall was its own nation once upon a time with its own language, customs, Celtic nation. Yeah, so that there's lots of kind of artists at the moment trying to revive the language, and I'm kind of part of that wider scene.
It's fascinating. And I mean, you're coming into this as a kind of outside or
Oh yeah,
and
an
that's
incomer.
really,
Yeah,
that's,
so I'm
that's
from
really,
I'm originally from Stoke-on-Trent in
yeah.
Manchester, so I'm not a Cornishman, but I'm
I mean,
immersing myself in that world.
that Celtic history of the United Kingdom is fascinating. Anything lined up for you? What's coming up for you? And
Yeah, so I've got another soundtrack for another game I've worked on called Tranquil Isle that's coming out in a few weeks as well. I think the game's out in on November the 14th, which is kind of this little world building game. It's like an island and you can build farms and houses. It's a really sweet game, very cozy, all pastel colors, and I've done this kind of lo-fi synthy soundtrack, which is sort of quite nostalgic. I'm really happy with it. I did it all on this little, I don't know if you can see this Yamaha PS20 there and the Juno here.
Yeah.
So I detached myself from my computer a little bit, which was good fun. Yeah, so that's coming up. Yeah, a piece of theatre that I compose music for is starting again soon. So, but yeah, I'm mostly focusing now on my Lady of Shalott project. That's like my big, and hopefully, who knows what will happen now Europa's out. Hopefully, I'll get some more game projects in the future. That would be
that's
the dream.
That sounds fantastic, and congrats on getting it over the line. And I really hope it does well for you.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, and I'm sure this will be of interest. If there are questions from the audience, feel free to post them in the comments, and we'll try to follow up.
Yeah, I can pop on and answer any questions if anyone has any questions.
It's been a really interesting insight into the specific game, but also a little bit broader as well, on how it works. So thanks a lot, sir. And
it's a pleasure.
Yeah, I'll definitely be looking to get hold of the vinyl for sure. Or maybe both, the Japan one and the rest of the world.
The whole hog.
Get the whole collection and get them signed by Matthew. All right.
Nice. All right.
Thanks
so
much,
Brian. Take care.
Take care. Have a great day. See you later.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.